Good evening, boys and ghouls. Welcome back to the channel. I am D, your humble host and guide through the ponderous perplexities of pictures past. In our journey through horror, we have arrived at the first decade of the new millennium, which I'm still not sure what to call. Aughts is apparently a common one, but I personally prefer the British term the noughties, because that's just delightful. Anyway, with this decade, whatever you want to call it, we truly entered the dark age of cinema, so called because of its tendency towards gritty realism and desaturated color schemes. As much a hangover from the bright 90s as a natural response to the state of the world at the time. It's an uneven decade to say the least. Now, on to the list. These are my picks for the top 10 horror movies of the noughties. Trick or Treat. This is one of my personal favorite October flicks, but I choose to place it low on the list because it's not really meant to be seen as a serious horror film, more as a Halloween mood maker. Trick or Treat is an anthology film, telling a few loosely interwoven stories that take place on the same night. The movie plays with the pagan origins of the holiday and reminds the viewer that there's a deeper meaning behind the traditions. The rules are there for a reason, and if you break them, you may incur the wrath of dark entities. Halloween is personified by the little character Sam, who has become something of an icon among horror fans. He plays the role of caretaker for the season, making sure that the traditions are kept. Trick or Treat would probably not scare your head off, but it's a gorgeous piece that just breathes Halloween goodness. Well deserved of a spot on the list. The Skeleton Key is a stylistic supernatural thriller that takes place in the American South. It's a tale of dark secrets and hoodoo magic. The story follows a hospice nurse, played by Kate Hudson, who while caring for an elderly cripple in a remote Louisiana mansion gets tangled up in the old mysteries and morbid ongoings of the place. The movie keeps a slow pace, always revealing tidbits of the plot but keeping you guessing throughout. This works great to keep the viewer invested, and towards the end the atmosphere is so thick you can practically taste it. It's difficult to talk about the movie without giving away too much. Let's just say that the suspense builds to a payoff that is sure to stick with you. Skeleton Key is as creepy as they come and atmospheric to boot. An absolute diamond in the rough. Paranormal Activity. The found footage genre had been going strong for years at this point, but few movies pulled off low-budget horror as well as this one. It's a story about a couple who suffers a demonic infestation, told exclusively through surveillance footage and home videos. This gives it a very genuine feel, with the added benefit of explaining away the barren script and the linear as hell storytelling. Paranormal Activity proves the old point that what you don't see is often scarier than what you do see, as you seldom get this invested in a movie where almost nothing ever happens. Upon its release, this movie was hyped to high heavens, largely due to a simple but effective marketing campaign. Then, of course, it was highly successful and got a string of sequels that all failed to live up to the original. So ignore them and focus instead on how effective the first Paranormal Activity actually is. As much a fan as I am of Rob Zombie as a musician, I'll be the first to admit that his side career as a movie maker has not exactly been stellar. But he has made a couple of good ones. The Devil's Rejects, I say, is his strongest yet. It's a sequel to The House of a Thousand Corpses, which is also a worthwhile flick, if not quite as powerful. This is a road movie of sorts, following the murderous Firefly family's attempt to escape justice in the form of a sheriff who's just as brutal as they are. The most interesting aspect of this is the moral shades of grey. The serial killer main characters are awful people, sure, but you kind of find yourself sympathizing with them, especially towards the end when they end up in some terrifying situations. Another sequel was released in 2019 to somewhat mixed reviews. If you only have time for one of them, Devil's Rejects is by far the safer bet. The Descent is one of the more original films of the decade. It follows a group of adventurous friends who accidentally get trapped when exploring an uncharted cave system. Their situation gets even worse when it turns out that they're not alone in the dark. The movie explores the character relationships in an interesting and progressive way, making their real journey one of introspection and self-discovery. When the movie was released in America, the ending was heavily recut to better suit the audience. This ending has nothing on the haunting original version though, so try to make sure you get the real ending. The Descent is a masterwork of claustrophobia and desperation. It saw its share of imitators in the years to follow, but as is often the case, the original is usually the best. The Grudge. Asian horror gained traction in the West in the early 2000s, much in part due to the Western horror landscape quickly growing stale at the time. The Grudge is a ghost story that put its own twist on the haunted house genre with infesting spirits and a deeper, brooding malevolence behind it. Like many noteworthy Asian horror films, The Grudge is not too heavy on scares. Instead, it works to maintain a foreboding atmosphere that'll make your skin crawl. The Grudge became popular even though many Westerners found its non-linear style confusing. Also, there were some cultural aspects that went over the head of many, myself included. The director Takashi Shimizu helmed an American remake a couple of years later which sought to adapt it to the West. I prefer the original though. It's the kind of movie that'll have you looking over your shoulder to make sure you're alone. Autant-genre or switchblade romance can be considered an aftershock of the neo-slasher trend of the 90s. With its plot about two young women attempting to escape a mysterious serial killer, it certainly bears a resemblance to the slasher concept, but it's also a story about mental illness and obsessive sexuality. It's sometimes said that Wes Craven or Tobe Hooper would have been proud to have made this, or for that matter M. Night Shyamalan, because there is a twist in this that has kinda split the audience. Personally, I didn't mind, and I thought it made the movie more interesting in the end. Autant-genre may be one of the last embers of a dying fire, but it's also an indication of where the horror genre was headed, namely... Saw became the start of the so-called torture porn genre that gained traction in the latter half of the decade, a more gritty and realistic relative of the old splatter genre. It's a logical continuation of the neo-slasher trend, but it also speaks for the dry cynicism of its time. The Saw franchise follows a simple yet appealing premise, where people wake up in complex traps designed to reflect their own vices and shortcomings. There's always a chance to escape, but it'll push your limits. The real strength here is, of course, that it gets you thinking. Could I end up in a similar situation? Would I survive? Personally, I find the torture porn genre generally unappealing, but I still think it's worth acknowledging just how good the first Saw movie really is. The franchise may have grown beyond its original cleverness, but still, this movie is pretty damn awesome. The Others. Alejandro Amenabar's neoclassical ghost story is, like many others of the decade, a result of the success of The Sixth Sense in the late 90s. But there's more to it than that. It's a slow-paced and gloriously atmospheric story about a woman and her two photosensitive kids set in a fog-wreathed, secluded mansion during World War II. Strange occurrences lead her to increasingly believe the mansion to be haunted, but it's not until the end that it's revealed to us what's really going on. Even after you know the secret though, it's a movie worth watching. Nicole Kidman is great in the lead role, but more impressive still are the children who really hold their own. The movie would have faltered if they had, but this is honestly some of the best child acting I've seen. The Others is a tale of hopelessness, of grief and isolation, paying homage to the old Gothics in a modern way. A little masterpiece in its own right. Alright, before we hit the top spot, let's go over some honorable mentions. 13 Ghosts is a movie that at first I didn't appreciate, but it's rapidly growing on me. Had I made this list later, I might well have included it. Slither is a fun one, maybe a bit too comedic for this list, which is why I kept it off. If you love you some grotesque horror comedy though, it's for you. In similar fashion, Zombieland and Shaun of the Dead are more on the comedic side as well. I love these movies to bits though, so if you haven't seen them, do check them out. Finally, Orphan was a movie that I really wanted to include. It was on and off for a while before it eventually stayed off. Great movie though. Now, there were many decent horror flicks made in this decade, but I was always quite sure what I wanted at the top of the list. Without further ado, here's my number one pick. The Orphanage, produced by always interesting Guillermo del Toro, is in my mind one of the most memorable ghost movies ever made. The Orphanage goes heavy on the atmosphere and depicts a grim reality. It follows a woman's struggle to save her adopted son who appears to have been kidnapped by ghosts, a struggle that soon turns into a mental journey. Aesthetically, this borrows quite a bit from the Asian horror scene, but it also contributes something unique of its own. Not to give away the ending, but it's easily one of the most haunting, crystal clear horror conclusions I've ever seen. A masterful ending to the best horror film of the decade. And that was my pick for the top 10 horror movies of the first decade of the millennium. Next time we cap off these series as we hit the 2010s. Join me there as we drive this baby home. Thanks for watching, catch you on the flip side.